I got a little secret to share with everybody. There's conflict everywhere. In case you didn't know it, there is conflict everywhere. It's out in the world. Don't believe me? Turn on the news, see latest on Russia and Ukraine. Conflict. It's in our families. Don't believe me? Just ask every married couple ever, right? There's conflict. Sadly, it's also in the church. There is conflict in the church, and, there's a lot of stories we can tell about it. Some of us have seen it. Some of us have experienced it. Some of us have understands it. And it's really a sad, sad thing, because that conflict seems to be worse in the church than anywhere else. I swear it seems to be worse there. This morning, as we continue to look further in the book of James, and we understand the basic principle of what James is doing, is he's talking to the early church. This is the first book written. And it's really written to a Judean Samaritan audience, perhaps with a few others scattered out. But he's really focusing on the Judean aspect. The Gentiles have not yet been brought into the fold. They have not yet been revealed. That's the way God's working. And so he's talking mainly to certain individuals very closely. And these individuals have no way of, if you will, learning, adapting, and growing in their own faith. So this is James' effort to take, if you will, the teaching of Jesus and apply it in a grander scheme to bring the current church to a more mature and closer walk with God. He talks this morning about conflict. It's something we'll see in chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. But the the problem I have with conflict, not only does it seem to be worse, but I think it's also a problem. It's the worst type of conflict. Because not only does it damage the reputation of the church, it also hurts the very people that the church serves. It not only damages the reputation of the church, but it hurts the people. My experience is that most of the church conflict, believe it or not, is non-theological issues. I know we have this big thing of the Reformation, right? When we think of church conflict, we think, the early reformers and, John Calvin and Martin Luther and those guys, they probably had church conflict to perhaps a greater extent than what we experience it. But most of the stuff we see in our time is non-theological. And just looking at this, I stumbled across an individual who I read. His name is Thomas Rainier, and he compiled a list of some things on his website, Thomas Rainier, or TomRainier.com. And he said here are some silly things that he's found church actually argue over. These are real things that cause problems in a church. Ready? I got to read a couple of them. There's an argument in one church over the appropriate length of the pastor's beard. You laugh. I know. There's actually another church had a dispute of whether or not to install restroom stall dividers in the women's restroom. Some of these things are kind of crazy. There was actually one time, one church had a 45-minute argument over a filing cabinet, whether it needed 2 drawers or 3. 45 minutes. There was even some church recommended or said that there was an argument over what type of green bean needed to be served at the potluck. Some places argue over their coffee. In one church, they moved from Folgers to Starbucks, and that split the congregation right down the middle. Another went from decaf to caffeinated or something, and that flipped the lid on people. Major conflict. Major, I tell you, coffee. There's also one that kind of humor, but whether or not it's appropriate for the church to serve deviled eggs. I can see that one. There have been arguments about people who has access to the office, such as the copy machine. Some churches, it's about the vacuum cleaner. Who gets to clean? These are silly things that people in the church argue about. And the sad thing is, I have experienced it myself. I've said this story before, but I remember the color on the girls' bathroom at the church I was growing up in. people got hurt and left. It's crazy to think about. But what is the root cause of all this conflict in the church? Because if it's not theological, why are we arguing about it? Why can't we have a peaceful agreement on things? Why can't we, just, roll with the punches, right? I mean, why do we have to just go along? Why do we have to rock the boat? What is the problem there? I believe James addresses that in James chapter 4. And as we read this passage, we will find that conflict happens because of us. It happens, quite frankly, because we struggle with others. And it happens, quite frankly, because we don't have a close walk with God. In short, conflict happens because we think of ourselves as we struggle with others when we are not right with the Lord. Conflict happens when we think of ourselves when we are struggling with others and we're not right with God. So if you can, turn with me to James chapter 1. We'll read the first 3 verses, and then we'll pick out some stuff. Just warning, I wrote a 5-page outline for this sermon, so it could go overtime. James 4:1, it reads, "What is the source of wars and fights among you? Don't they come from the cravings that are at war within you? You desire and do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and you war and you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and don't receive because you ask with wrong motives, so you may spend it on your evil desires." Conflict. Right there he says, what is the source of those conflicts? Conflicts happen because of ourselves. What he says here is just kind of hard to miss. It happens because of what's going on inside. Right? What is inside? What is that term? And I kind of run this over. It says the wars and fights that happen. What is the source of these wars and fights? Other translations will use the word quarrels or conflicts. It means to make a fight, to make a war, to literally be at battle. This is the image of, strapping on your sword, putting on your helmet, grabbing your shield, and going out there to combat something. I mean, literally, we're talking to people who are in the church. These are people who are sitting next to you in the pew. These are people who are facing the same discrimination you are. These are the same people that are facing everyday problems that you are. You got to remember, that early church was facing all kinds of pressure from all kinds of sides. They are a largely Jewish congregation. And if you do not worship at the temple, if you do not go to the temple, right, and offer sacrifices, you kind of look at you kind of funny and they stop associating with you. You have a social pressure from your fellow Jews. You also have the pressure, quite frankly, from the chief priests because they know you're different and you're a threat. You followed that Jesus guy, right? So there is a political pressure. And we see the Apostle Paul in his early life went around and gathered these people up and threw them in jail. So there is a fear that you're running with. There's an issue you're having with just the peer pressure as well as the political climate. And yet you pick a fight with the guy sitting next to you. That's what James is saying. Does this make sense, people? Does this make sense? What is the source of these fights? And he says, don't they come from the cravings that are at war within you? Other translations will use the word desires. The Greek word always has a negative connotation in the New Testament. The passionate desires for a worldly pleasure mark those that are not right with God, and they are an internal source of the external conflict in the church. John MacArthur said that, I believe. And it's a concept of basically saying it's the stuff that is out there that we bring in here. And then we fight about it because we got that issue, something inside of us, right? So, what are those issues that we can look at? As Plato said, the sole cause of wars and revolutions and battles is nothing other than it's the body and its desires. Plato. Interesting guy right there. But I believe the Apostle John laid out what the 3 problems in life are. He calls them, as we read in the front of your worship folder, in 1 John 2:16. He says, there's the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the boastful pride in life, right? The lustful eyes refers to an intense desire or craving for material possessions or things that are appealing to the senses. It's often associated with covetousness and desire to acquire what others had. Greed, covetousness, envy. That's what we're talking about there, the lust of the eyes. You look at it and you want it, right? That's the danger we have. The first danger we always have is basically based on our eyes, what we see and what we decide we want. He talks about the lust of the flesh also. When the fleshly desires rule us, taking priority over God's will, they can cause us to violate God's righteousness. Now, I know automatically our brains go in one direction when we hear the lust of the flesh, but the reality is it boils down to anything that we desire to make our life more comfortable or fill a need that we have, such as food. Food can be this issue. You go ahead and eat too much. It's called gluttony. Believe it or not, it's listed as a sin in the Bible. Eating too much. Okay, I'm guilty of that one a lot. But, wow, when you start thinking about it, when we have that desire to eat, we keep going overboard. If that desire rules us, it can lead to things. Same is true with things like we automatically think about, like sex. It's a natural God-given desire. It's a healthy sign of a relationship within a married couple. But if we go outside those bounds and we let that rule our lives, it can lead to things like adultery, pornography, and sexual assault. If we let our desires rule our bodies, it takes us down the path of the straight and narrow and brings us to the path of wide destruction. The lust of the eyes, what we look at and what we tempted by, the lust of the flesh, the things in our body that we try to do so. The boastful pride of life. GodAnswers.com or .org says this. It says the pride of life can be defined as anything of the world, meaning anything that leads to arrogance, pride in self, presumption, and boasting. These are things that we fight for, our positions, our titles. I have to pause and say I think some pastors really struggle with this. When you see what it says, it's the doctor, reverend, so on and so forth. And then after their name, they have like 16 different alphabet letters. I mean, wow. Some people really struggle with this, that boastful pride of life. Look, this is what we are. We want to build ourselves up. Look at our position. Look at our importance, how great we are. And you know what? That is the problem we have. John makes it clear that anything that produces the pride of life comes from a love of the world. It does not come from God. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. 3 areas that we really struggle with internally: the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and our stinking pride. Conflict happens because of that was within us, but it rears its ugly head when we struggle with others. Take a look at what he actually does say right there in verse 2. He says, you desire and do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and you war and you do not have because you do not ask. There's a lot of things here that be unpacked, but the reality is, when I look at this, I'm not thinking these guys are murdering each other. Right? I don't see people in the pew murdering each other. You lose your standing if you do that, right? Everyone knows you're a murderer then. Instead, I remember what Jesus said. If any man calls his brother a fool, right? He's guilty. I think that's what James is going out to. He's basically saying there's a whole line of sin that happens before you lead up to murder, including hate and anger and bitterness and envy and strife. All of those line up before you get to the murder part. And what James is basically saying is your attitude is so bad that you could commit murder. And he's like, why do we do that? What is the problem? Because we have this desire that is driven by our unrighteousness. And we will fight the bitter end for whatever that desire is. Oftentimes in church, we see it over pride or position or who's right and who's wrong. Right? We do. Where's that vacuum cleaner get kept? I get to decide where to put it. That's my position. I'm the decider of the vacuum cleaner. My title. It's crazy to think about. And then you get really upset when you have an usher come in and he's actually telling people, where to sit and all that. And then someone else comes in and tells, oh, why don't you sit over there? No, that's my job. No, it doesn't matter. You can see how it just spirals downhill. When we get that way, and it leads to bitterness and stuff, and so we end up with this idea of murder and coveting. And it seems funny because it says right there, you desire all this stuff, but you do not have it. You want your position, you want your pride, you want what is yours in your own mind, but you do not have it. And that leads you to the whole, if you will, gauntlet of sin that leads up to and including murder. We see it in the world. We see it in Hollywood movies, for crying out loud, right? Turn on the television set and watch how it all plays out, and you can say, yeah, it lines up, right? That guy was jealous of this person, so, in order to get his job, he had to off that guy. And there you have your murder show. I really should work for Hollywood. I'm a great writer. But the bottom line is you want something you do not have. And so what you do is you murder, and you have all those envy. You have all that problem. Conflict happens because of our struggles in ourselves boil over into struggles with others. Right? And it says one thing real funny here. It says, you fight in war you do not have because you do not ask. One of the major problems, I think, with the church today is prayer. A lack of it. I grew up thinking, first and foremost, solve your own problems. Right? I learned that from my dad. I'll blame him all day long. But the car breaks down, you try to fix it. The printer's not working, you try to get the printer working. Something's not right, you look at it and try to solve it yourself. Before you do anything else, you do it yourself, right? Save yourself some money, my dad says. He's right. He's right. You save yourself money. Except when it comes to interpersonal relationships. You try to handle a broken relationship by yourself. You try to handle something with people by yourself. You try handling anything by yourself. What happens? Usually it backfires on you. What does James say the problem is? You do not have what you're looking for because you're not even talking to God about it. You're not even raising Him, the one who cares so much for you and planned your life out to the very minute detail. You're not even talking to the Almighty. You ask, never. Or in my case, it's somewhere in the middle, right? You start yourself and you go down that checklist. Do this, this, this. Oh, now it's time to pray. And then after prayer, try a couple more things before calling someone outside to help, right? That's a problem we all have. A lack of prayer. We need to. Christians are often the ones that try to get through their natural or fleshly issues with nothing more than elbow grease. And oftentimes that is the problem we have. Why is that a problem? Why is that really a problem? And I will submit to you because that shows that a person is not walking rightly with God. If you are not walking in step with the Almighty, that whenever you experience a problem, the very first thing you do is talk to God. If that is what you are doing right now, I congratulate you. You're better than me. But if you're like me, and that's never the first thing, well, consider this sermon to be for you too. The problem we have in this world is we're not relating well with God. We don't have that close communication with Him. We don't have that right way with God. And why is that? Because God does, believe it or not, have a standard that we have to live our lives by. Right? He does. And when things called sin get in the way of that standard, it also gets in the way of our relationship with Him. When sin is there, and we see the boastful pride of life, when someone is so happy and proud about their position, their title, their glory, whatever, or they're so focused on their dinner plate that they can't see other problems in the world, or they're all worried about themselves and what they see their neighbor having, and they're all wrapped up in these thoughts. They're not wrapped up in the thoughts of the Almighty. There is no spiritual gain to be had of a person who's got his mind on earthly things. There is very little room for God to work with in that. And what do we do when we do ask? Usually we ask with the wrong motives. You know that? You get mad, so you ask God for patience. That's the silliest thing ever, people. Do you not know patience is a muscle? God will give you the patience because he gives you problems. And you got to work it at it. Don't ask for patience if you don't want problems, okay? We are trying to wrestle with the conflicts that we experience. These lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, the boastful pride of life, and we don't include God in the picture, we're going to fail. And when we do ask, we're looking for what? A resolution for peace for ourselves. We're not looking for his glory or his will. James says, you ask and don't receive because you ask with the wrong motives. So you may spend it on your own evil desires. It's a sign of things not right with God, when all we turn to him and try to resolve it. So that's the problems that we have. That's the conflict we experience. What is the solution? I believe Paul says that in Philippians. Philippians chapter 2, 3 through 8. This is a passage that you could probably write a whole dissertation on. But Philippians 2, it says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility consider others as more important than yourselves. Everyone should look not to his own interests, but rather to the interests of others. Adopt the same attitude as Jesus Christ, who, existing in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be exploited. Instead, he emptied himself by assuming the form of a servant, taking on the likeness of humanity. And when he became as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. How do we not have conflict in the church? Well, Paul says right there, don't do anything with selfish ambition. Consider others more important than yourself. Look after the other interests of others. And then he gives us the great example of all that, Jesus Christ. Adopt that attitude. Who, being found in the nature of God, who being the form of God, and do not consider equality with God as something to be exploited. Other translations will use the word to be grasped, to be held on to be something you can, show off. Instead, he emptied himself by assuming the form of a servant, taking on the likeness of a humanity. And when he becomes a man, he humbled himself to death, even the worst death possible. How do we avoid conflict in our lives? How do we avoid conflict in the church? There's going to be points of conflict in your life. I guarantee you that. And sometimes those points of conflict are justified. If I stand up here and say something that is not godly or not biblical, we have a point of conflict that you should take up with me. Absolutely. If someone breaks into your house to rob your items, there's a point of conflict you should have, and you should address that immediately. But when it's over something silly like what kind of green beans you take to the potluck, what does James say? He goes, that's because you're too proud for your own self. You're asking for stuff and you have problems. And Paul says, humble yourselves. Put the needs of others first. A relationship that is in step with God has one thing that you can always count on. They will always put the needs of others before themselves. That should be our standard. That should be our standard. This morning we have seen that conflict happens because of us, because we struggle with others, and because we do not have a good relationship with God. Conflict happens because we think of ourselves when we struggle with others, because we're not right with the Almighty. The simple solution, although I would admit it's very hard to do, is to follow the path God desires. And as he says, you got to put others yourself. When we do this, we will have peace with most of our conflicts. In short, let's try that. Let's be stewards of peace in the church of bride of Christ. That's how we can let our light shine. Let us attempt to put into practice the words of the Apostle Paul. Everyone should not look to his own interests, but rather to the interests of others. Let's close with a word of prayer.